Everyone, welcome to this week's ISE webinar. Tristram, who I'm going to pass over to you in just a minute, will be going through the findings of the latest ISE recruitment survey, which came out a few weeks ago. I'm guessing some of you might have come to the event that we had in London as well, which is great. Just a few housekeeping things. Well, really only housekeeping is, obviously, if you have any questions, just type them up in the questions dashboard, and then I will run them through Tristram at the end of the presentation. So if you do have a question, do write it, and then I'll go through everything at the end, and then everything's available for after the webinar as well. So without further ado, Tristram, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you for everybody who's attending the webinar. We're going to get going straight away, and I'll tell you a bit about the research that we've done and draw out some key findings. As Tom says, there's opportunity at the end to ask some questions. So if you have a thought as we're going through, then just add it into the question box, and we'll see if we can answer it for you at the end. So, we've published this year's Inside Student Recruitment Report, which looks at the key sort of trends and issues that are going on in recruitment. And we've published it in this rather fetching spiral design. So if you go on our website, you can get the full report. There's a lot of information in it, so I'm not going to try and cover absolutely everything today, but hopefully you'll get some of the key insights, and then we can always talk about more things as we go through. So we conducted the study in July and August. It was a survey of ISE members, and over half of our members answered it, and the responses that we have cover a whopping 37,000 student hires, and we had kind of good response from all sectors. So we can tell you a little bit about how some of these things vary by sector. So if we start off, we're going to just try and draw out maybe 10 key insights I think are particularly helpful to you to think about in terms of what comes out of this report. So our first insight is that firms are resourcing recruitment, and that the graduate labour market is not just something that happens by magic, it's something which takes time and money to really make work. And so the average firm is spending around about £3,000 for every person they hire. They're using about a team of about 4 people. They're often bringing in external people for particular functions, freelancers, outsourcing some of their activities and so on. So this is big business. There's a lot of activity happening, and obviously there's similar kind of level of engagement on the student or university or apprenticeship side. So there's lots of people involved in bringing firms into contact with education so that they can actually recruit new employees. So if we then move on to our second insight, it relates to the apprenticeship levy. And so for those of you who are keen followers of the ISE, you will remember that we did some research on apprenticeships back in the, we published it in around about June. And a lot of the findings that we have in this study really echo what we said there. The average firm that we're talking to is spending over £1 million on its apprenticeship levy every year. About a third of that amount of money, they're only succeeding in using about a third of that money. So there's a lot of pressure on firms to increase the number of apprenticeships and their spend on apprenticeships. And as a result of that, we had out of all the hires that we were looking at, 11,000 of them were apprentices. Now we're going to say a little bit more about that because it's not as straightforward as it might initially appear. So when we asked people who were those apprentices and we broke them down, around about a quarter of them were actually graduates who were finishing graduate schemes and going on to apprenticeships or finishing from the university and going on to apprenticeships as part of their graduate scheme. So firms are using the apprenticeship levy to pay for their graduate schemes. About another quarter of that is being used to pay for existing staff. So to put people who are already working for the firm onto apprenticeships as part of their training and upskilling. And about 50% of that is then being spent on non-graduate new entry-level hires. So that's probably what you would think of as being the sort of traditional apprentice. And so only about half of the money that is being used by the apprenticeship levy is being spent on perhaps what we might, if we weren't a bit more informed about this system, we might think of as the typical apprentice. We then broke this down by level, and we can see the different levels that apprentices are being employed on, and we can see that there's a lot of firms that are employing level 3 apprenticeships, and then a lot that are also employing level 6 and level 7 apprentices. So we can see we've sort of got 2 key points of entry really for this. So we've got the kind of level 3 entry point, and then the level 6 entry point as well. So our third insight is that mental well-being matters, and we could have broadened that out. We talk a lot about diversity in the ISE, and in general there's a high interest in diversity, but we focused in on mental well-being, particularly this year. We found that most firms, 78% of firms, have a mental well-being policy. They're placing high priority on the mental well-being of their staff, and about 40%, 43% of them are now addressing this in the recruitment process. So they're actually talking to students about mental well-being, which our other research that we've done, that we published with the Hype Collective earlier in the year, was saying that students were quite concerned about this. So we think this is a very good development. So our fourth insight is to say that the graduate labour market is pretty buoyant. Most sectors are reporting increases, and overall people were reporting that they recruited 10% more students this year than they did last year into their graduate positions. Almost all of our respondents are recruiting graduates, and they're generally pretty positive about the graduates they find and are able to fill pretty much all of their vacancies. So the graduate market is going pretty well. And as a result of that, we can look at graduate salaries, and we can see that there's some pretty high salaries going on here. Our average starting salary amongst ISE firms is about £29,000 a year. If we look at that across time, we can see that we've seen a steady increase in graduate salaries over this period. So we can also see that the starting salaries at ISE members are rather different, rather higher than the average graduate salary. And that's worth knowing, because our members tend to be larger employers, they tend to be more likely to be in London, and they tend to be offering higher quality jobs and higher salaries than the average graduate employer. So, but when we look at this in real terms, and it's important always to do this and to think about, well, okay, we've seen salaries going up, but can it buy you more? We can see that actually the modern graduate can buy a little bit less with their money than their equivalent who graduated just before the recession. So if you were graduating in 2008, you were doing pretty well. Now we're starting to see some recovery, but we're still saying that the average graduate is earning slightly less in real terms than the equivalent graduate a few years ago. So if we move on to non-graduate hires, and so we're asking people about things like school leavers. Most of them are school leavers or college leavers, in fact. Some are being recruited from perhaps a period of youth unemployment or from a sort of low-level job, but most coming straight from school. And we can see that those numbers are also increasing, although there's a big drop-off in retail that we'd be interested in ideas from the retail sector as to why that's happened. But in general, we've seen an increase that's sort of roughly similar to the size of increase that we've seen in graduates. But the total number of non-graduate hires is only about a third of that of graduate hires. So we're seeing, although we're seeing some growth here, we're still saying that amongst our employers, when they're thinking about entry-level staff, graduates are still king, even though they're under some pressure to increase the number of non-graduate hires. Non-graduate salaries are a lot lower than the graduate salary. But obviously these people are starting potentially at the age of 16 or 18 or 19, whereas our graduates are starting somewhat older. So one of the things that will be interesting is to look at how these salaries increase. And certainly from talking to many employers, many of them are looking at ways of aligning their non-graduate entry route so that by the time a non-graduate has finished their, say, apprenticeship and a graduate has finished their graduate scheme, they're earning similar amounts. But obviously that will vary across firms. Moving on to our sixth insight, we can say that internships and placement students, so these short-term temporary hires that are usually done with current higher education students, these numbers are slightly down this year. So the firms that responded to the survey are offering slightly less of these temporary placements than they were the previous year. But that is largely driven by a substantial fall in the engineering, energy and industry sector. And it will be interesting to think a bit more about why that is. We certainly think it's possible that this sector is under some pressure, and although they're not generally reducing their recruitment levels, their ability to take on short-term hires with the additional work that entails may be lower. So the average salary that interns and placement students are getting is around about 19,000, so quite similar to what the non-graduate entry hires are. But they're very good opportunities because they're recruiting about half of these people, so employers are recruiting about half of these people back into their jobs. So if you do an internship, about half of the people who do an internship will go back to that same firm and start as a graduate the next year or the year after. So our seventh insight is that some roles are tricky to fill, and the ones that are tricky to fill are probably not that surprising to people, but they're things around engineering, IT, technical and analytical roles. For non-graduates, we could also bring accountancy in there as a kind of important one that people found difficult to fill. And so there are a number of more technical areas where often employers struggle to fill the roles that they're looking for. And they're not very optimistic about this. Quite a lot of employers feel that these roles will get more difficult to fill as we go through time. So when we asked them to look forward another 5 years, they said, yeah, some of these technical roles, we expect them to get more difficult to find. So firms also are continuing to attract a lot of applicants, and this is one of the challenges with our sort of understanding of the labour market. Is we are in a strange situation where the graduate labour market is pretty good, employers are pretty satisfied, they're getting lots of applicants, they're able to fill pretty much all of their roles, but there are also some areas where people are struggling to fill those roles. So those engineering and technical roles that we talked about. But in general, people are getting lots of applications for their graduate, to an average of about 50 per post, less for the other types of hires, but still decent numbers, so 20 for every non-graduate post and so on. We then look at what's the most effective way to attract different kinds of applicants, and employers were pretty clear that visiting universities as well as having a good, strong web presence for their different vacancies was a very good way to attract different kinds of students to their vacancies. And if we move on to then look at selection, we found that firms were using quite a wide variety of different selection approaches. They describe these in a variety of ways. So one of the questions that we're often asked is about whether strengths or competency-based approaches are predominating. And we've certainly seen a growth in strength-based approaches over the last few years. And I've heard other people say that that means that the competency-based approaches are dying out. That doesn't seem to be the case. And in fact, when we look and do a bit more analysis, we find that most of our employers are using more than one approach. And I think that's a really important thing for people to realize, both those who are involved in selection, but also those who are preparing students to go and enter selection processes, is that you need to prepare people to manage more than one kind of selection. process, because it's very likely that in any single selection process, they'll run across a few different types of approach. Firms have quite a lot of faith in assessment centres, and when we ask what's the most effective way, they say that assessment centres are really the most effective thing that you can do. Interviews, psychometric tests are also very important as well, but the clearest sort of way of discerning who's a good candidate who will work in your firm is through these more extended forms of assessment through assessment centres. And to finish up, we'll have a little look at the future. Some of our employers had some concerns about the future. They were worried about whether there was going to be an economic recession. They were concerned about Brexit. And we actually asked whether, if you said, are you worried about either an economic recession or Brexit or both, we found that the majority of employers were saying, yes, we're worried about one of those things. And what they feel is that these kind of big shifts in macroeconomic policy are likely to lead to them recruiting less people than they otherwise would have done. We also asked them about lots of other things. They're not so worried about technological changes, artificial intelligence, and so on. They're not so worried about changes of government or demography or the growth of the gig economy and so on. So it's these big economic things that employers are anticipating are going to shift and change the kinds of recruitment or the kinds of level of recruitment that they're doing. So that's something of a whistle-stop tour of the different key insights that come out of the ISE report, the latest recruitment report. You can, of course, download it off of our website, and I'm very happy to answer questions offline about this as well. But I think now we've got a good opportunity to have a bit of discussion and debate. So if people have got any questions that they would like to ask, I'm very happy to get into those questions.
So yeah, Tristram, we have a question from Lizzie. She asks, have strength-based assessments increased over the last few years?
Yes, that's absolutely right. They have increased. We've seen a steady increase in strengths-based. So it's absolutely right that employers should look seriously at strengths-based approaches because other employers are doing the same. It's also right that students who are applying should be competent to answer strengths-based approaches. But what we also would say is that does not mean that you will only be looking at strengths-based approaches. So our experience was that, as we see on this slide, that most employers are using a variety of different techniques to undertake selection processes.
Perfect. If anyone else has any questions, get them typed up so I can ask Tristram in the next couple of minutes. In the meantime, actually, no, we've got one from Rowena, actually. Does the report give any insight into progress against diversity initiatives?
Yes, it does. So what we've learned, and there's a section on diversity in the report, and what it draws out is that there is increased priority in comparison to the last few years from firms against almost all areas of diversity. So class, race, gender, and so on. People are more interested in these things, and firms are doing more. It also tells us that there are a large number of firms that are actually making some very concrete changes as a result of diversity. So things like name blind applications, university blind applications, these kinds of things, but also outreach, working with community groups, a whole set of different things, changing the way people's marketing is organized. There's lots of very concrete actions. Whether we can see a real change in the overall level of diversity in firms, I think is a bit more questionable. And that's partly, I think, because it's more difficult for firms to monitor some of that precisely. And so, for example, we have some figures saying that the number of state school students who are employed in graduate employers is quite low, much lower than you would find in the population. but it tends to be the firms that feel that to be a problem that monitor that quite closely. So they're the ones that are able to provide us with data on that. But yeah, I think we can certainly say that there is a growing awareness around diversity issues and that firms are taking these issues pretty seriously.
Thanks, Tristram. Another one from Marina, actually, which is, she says, fingers crossed, did you get a cost per hire for apprentices?
Did I get a cost per hire for apprentices? I can probably work that out if you would like to send me a question on that. Okay. We can have a look at that and see what kind of figures that we can get from that. Our cost per hire, I think that figure that we gave, yeah. So the figure that we gave, which was around about £3,000, was for all types of hires. And so in previous years' reports, we've tended to report the graduate figure, but this is for all types of hire. So yeah, we could probably have a go at working out something around apprenticeships. So if you're interested in that, then send me a query and we can have a look at that.
Oh, you've got it on your last slide, Tristram, so I'm guessing you've got your email address there somewhere for everyone to shoot you some questions.
Sorry, right? Yeah, I've actually, so you're very welcome. I've just gone to the other end of mine.
Why you do that?
Very welcome to actually, my email that would be better for people to use would be Tristram at ISE. So it's very simple, Tristram at ise.org.uk. That would be my email address. So please feel free to send me an email on that.
A simpler question. Andrew asks, how many organisations took part in the survey this year?
So we had 153 valid responses. So we tend to, sometimes we get duplicate responses from employers. Sometimes we get ones where people don't give us really sufficient information for us to be able to respond and so on. So once we got rid of all those, we had 153 employers, which is about 55% of the ISE membership, or at the time at which we calculated it, it was that. And as I said earlier, it covers almost 40,000 hires in total. So it's a pretty large chunk of the graduate labour market.
Okay. Sam Smith asks, beyond salary, are firms doing anything else to promote social mobility for internships, such as helping with travel costs or accommodation?
Yeah, so we asked, in terms of the diversity issues, we did ask questions about changes to salary. We didn't ask them specifically around internships, but certainly there's lots of firms that are considering things like adding in travel, paying travel costs for students to come to interviews and things like that. I haven't seen very many who are doing accommodation for interns. I did actually have a very interesting conversation with one of our members in the light of this report the other day, who was talking about how we deal with paying for mobility costs. So when people want to move, particularly to start on a graduate position. And one of the things that we looked at was that although the number of firms offering specific mobility, so help with moving expenses and things like that is relatively low, there's also the kind of golden handshake approach where people give perhaps a month's salary or half a month's salary or something like that up front. And generally, if you look at the rationale for those, is for those kinds of things, is to help people to move to different areas who haven't necessarily got money. So these things are definitely being thought about, and there is some detailed stats in the report on them.
Thank you. Catherine asks, why do you think, actually this is a really good question, why do you think that the engineering and energy sectors are seeing a downturn compared to the other sectors?
I mean, I don't know. I suspect there'll be people listening to this who are from that sector who might have stronger ideas. I've had a conversation with a few of the members about this to try and understand why that might be. And it's not a general downturn in recruitment. That's the thing to be clear about. It's a downturn, particularly in these temporary hires, but it was quite a substantial one, so it's quite surprising. And the only thing that we can think is that particularly with Brexit and so on, many manufacturing and industrial sorts of employers are under quite a lot of pressure, and the particularly for short-term hires, there's a level at which that draws more resources than it actually generates from firms, and it may feel that people just don't have the time to do it at the moment. But I'd be interested to hear more from engineering and manufacturing employers to see what they think about this.
Tracy Hill asks, in regards to the continued value placed on in terms of on-campus engagement, is there a change in what the engagement looks like, e.g. a shift away from attending fairs, working more closely with the curriculum?
Actually, no, I would say that is not the case, and I would have kind of expected it to be. What we can say is that things like fairs and various forms of sort of low input sort of interactions are still very, very popular. And actually the employers rate them quite highly as being useful as well, which was, you know, surprising to me, because I hear quite a lot of complaints and moans about things like careers fairs as not being as useful as people would like. But I guess that the issue is that the ability to organise people into more substantial curriculum forms of interaction is much more difficult. And so less employers have got experience of it, and less employers therefore can see the immediate benefits of it. But I mean, I think from the kind of educational point of view, we would definitely say that those kinds of things are more valuable. Students learn more and develop their career more through these kinds of more substantial forms of interaction with employers. But from an employer point of view of just trying to kind of get the maximum number of applications or recruits, then there's something of a trade-off between these deeper types of approaches and the more kind of one day or ephemeral kinds of approaches.
Perfect. That's it for questions, Tristram. So an announcement for the next webinar, which I think, Tristram, you're doing as well. Yeah, making the most of ISE data.
Good. Okay. We look forward to seeing people there. We'll be talking in that webinar about some of this data and how you might make use of it in universities or in businesses as part of your case, and how you can access more data from us than is just, you can just find in the reports.
Perfect. Okay, well, have a lovely rest of the afternoon, evening, and we will see everyone at the upcoming events that we've got, obviously the physical events. So first one being on the 10th of October, which is our apprentice and school leaver forum, and then if not, the day before, virtually meet on the webinar. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.